Good. Thank you very much for coming this morning. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Welcome to the Guildhall. My name's Anna Scott and I'm the Assistant Director for Transported, and we're an arts programme that works across Boston and South Holland, and we're based at the University of Lincoln. Today's talk's been scheduled to mark the 250th anniversary of what became known as the Boston Tea Party in Boston, Massachusetts. That fateful day marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and its colonies in America, triggering a series of events that would ultimately lead to a revolutionary war for those colonies' independence and the subsequent formation of a new nation, a United States of America. So what has this got to do with our Boston? It was from here, a little under a century and a half prior to all of this, that a congregation left for America to establish an eponymous colony under the Massachusetts Bay Company, encouraged by their minister at that time, Reverend John Cotton, as part of John Winthrop's fleet. The strands that connect and sometimes divide the two Bostons have continued through the years and are coming into focus once again as we head towards a quatercentenary in 2030, when it will be 400 years since Boston in Massachusetts was established. Our story starts sometime before the 1630 voyages of the Winthrop ships with some other prospective colonists, the Pilgrims of the Mayflower. To start to be able to understand the events of just over 400 years ago, we need to have some background to religion at that time. It's also important to remember that religion was not a separate part of social life in the way that it can be in our secular society today, but integral to people's day-to-day lives and beliefs. It was a way to explain the world and everything in it. The 16th century saw rapid change in state religion, consequent to the Reformation and the changing monarchs at that time. In 1603, James I came to the throne. He was already King James VI in Scotland, following Queen Elizabeth I's death. James was seen as a reformer by the Puritan Protestant reformers who wanted to purify the church, moving away from some of the rituals. But James was wary of the challenges to the authority of the church and its bishops, and consequently to him as the head of that church. He declared that those challenging this state authority would be harried out of the land. Groups of separatists began to form in congregations. They wanted to organise themselves in these groups and be free from the hierarchy of the church. The so-called separatists objected to the prescriptive methods of worship directed through the established church and wanted to have the freedom to worship as they wished. Instead of trying to reform and purify the church from within, as the Puritans endeavoured to do, they wanted to separate from it entirely, hence separatists. Worship in secret, outside of the order of the established church, risked persecution and arrest by the authorities. It was an illegal and a dangerous choice. The groups that we're interested in became known as the Pilgrims, and they emerged primarily in North Nottinghamshire and Gainsborough. Pressures from the authorities on this group were increasing in 1606 and 1607, and life was becoming more intolerable for them. The iconography of the Pilgrims is dominated by 19th century representations of Puritans clad in black and white with large, often buckled hats, which they didn't wear, which has run concurrent to the development of a heavily mythologised ideal of the Pilgrim Fathers, so they forgot about the women, as a group of wise older men, elders, pioneers and moral exemplars, which is typified here in George Bouton's 1867 painting of pilgrims going to church. Let's look now at the story of the Pilgrims and something of their history and connections to Boston. One of the most well-known of the Pilgrims was their eventual governor in America, William Bradford. Bradford was from Austerfield in present-day South Yorkshire, about 65 miles from Boston. As a youth, he attended services led by Reverend Richard Clifton in Babworth Church, some 10 miles from Austerfield, at a time when you were required to attend your local church, So already at this point, they were starting to stretch the limits of what you were allowed to do. Bradford lost his parents early on. He came from a farming family and was unwell as a child, which prevented him from being outside with other children. So he spent his time reading and studying scripture. Reverend Clifton was a radical and compelling cleric who was appointed as vicar of Babworth Church in 1586. He was a Brownist separatist preacher who followed the strongly dissenting approach of the established church named after Robert Brown. The young William Bradford also met William Brewster of Scrooby Manor there, and when Clifton was expelled from the church, many in his congregation were inspired to worship with him in secret, including Bradford. Bradford later described Clifton in his diary of Plymouth Plantation as a grave and reverend preacher who by his pains and diligence has done much good and under God had been a means of conversion of many. William Brewster is another well-known pilgrim name associated with Nottinghamshire. His family home, Scrooby Manor, was originally a moated site and Archbishop's Palace, used by the Archbishops of York during the 13th and 14th centuries. Brewster was Master of the Post, which was an important official at a site on the Great North Road, the main route from London to Edinburgh. He was a bailiff for the Archbishop of York, taking over his father's job in the mid-1590s. Brewster has been called the Pilgrim Elder and Spiritual Guide. At the same time as this group began to meet in Brewster's home, another separatist congregation began to form in Gainsborough, led by the former city preacher from Lincoln, John Smith. Bradford was a committed member of the Scrooby congregation, and when some of the separatists decided to travel to Boston in 1607, he travelled with them. They were starting to plan their escape from the country. The separatists in Gainsborough left around this time for Amsterdam, and the Scrooby congregation would soon follow. We know that in Boston they conducted unlawful assemblies and worshipped in secret meetings called conventicles, whilst making plans to leave for Holland, where they believed they would be free from religious persecution and intolerance. For many years, little was known of the arrest of the separatists in Boston, other than William Bradford's recording of the event in Old Plymouth Plantation, documenting the Pilgrims' story. But more recently, a small and insignificant looking piece of parchment was rediscovered in Lincolnshire archives, where it had survived within the records relating to the Spalding Court of Sewers. So what was the Court of Sewers? These courts were established by Henry VIII in 1531 to protect fertile coastal marshlands. They were led by gentlemen of the county who were often magistrates or justices of the peace. The Spalding Court of Sewers would have included justices from Boston, and these would have been the people who tried the Pilgrims after their arrest. Researcher Larry Kreitzer transcribed the document in full. It's a little bit hard to read. He revealed a list of names which includes some of the most important people in the Pilgrims' story and significant others who played a role in Boston's history and beyond. It was written as a formal charge drawn up for either the judges in Boston or the higher assize court in Lincoln. The arrest was for conducting illegal assemblies and secret religious meetings, or what were called illicit conventicles in Boston. Significantly, the charge also indicates that the group were in Boston for up to 3 months before their arrest, far longer than previously thought, and suggesting theirs was not a passing relationship with the town. Their full names and social status, such as gentleman, yeoman, teacher or cleric, are often abbreviated in the document, and so Kreitzer made some inferences about their identities. It reads, "The justices for the Lord King on their oath present that William Bingham, gentleman, Robert Yeoman, John Hoe, teacher, William Brewster, gentleman, Robert Rochester, yeoman, Richard Clifton, cleric, Edward Knight, gentleman, George W., gentleman, Thomas Goss, yeoman, William Fisher, yeoman, Leonard Beatson, draper, Samuel Letcham, shoemaker, John Coppin, yeoman, Edward Armfield, yeoman, Thomas Helwys, plotting and intending to scandalise and bring into contempt the true and pious religion established in this kingdom of England, On such a day and year aforesaid, William Bingham, Robert E., etc., not attending, not having repaired to the aforesaid parish church of Boston and the aforesaid county, nor to any other churches, chapels, or other usual places of communal prayer, at any time within the 3 months immediately preceding the holding convening of this inquisition, they like long sentences here, to hear divine service according to the published order of the Book of Common Prayer, maliciously and with seditious intent, in the aforesaid Boston, in the aforesaid county of Lincoln, were present at certain illicit assemblies, conventicles and conventions, many unlawful assemblies, conventicles and meetings, on the colour and pretext of the exercise of religion, in manifest contempt of the said Lord King, now reigning, and of his laws, and against the peace, etc., and also contrary to the form of the statute, etc. Mixed up with the more well-known separatists known to have been meeting illegally in Boston, including William Brewster and Richard Clifton, was a Boston draper called Leonard Beatson. So, after 3 months of not repairing to the parish church, we hear from Bradford what happened next as they plotted their escape from the country entirely, a dramatic and famous account of their arrest outside Boston. The group were aware that they could practice their religion and worship as they wished in Holland, and eventually made arrangements for a ship's captain to meet them and take them there from near the port of Boston. Brewster had been, in a former life, an assistant to Queen Elizabeth's diplomat in Amsterdam, Sir William Davison, before his downfall as a scapegoat for the death of Mary, Queen of Scots. So, he had seen what life there was like, and that churches had more freedom there for congregations to organise themselves and be tolerated, unlike the situation in England. This passionate and determined group of men, women and children travelled 60 miles from Scrooby and other villages near the town of Gainsborough to meet the ship. Many were young families with radical and determined beliefs. The ship eventually arrived. At once on board, they found, no doubt to their horror, that the captain had betrayed them. They were surrounded by soldiers, and after rifling through their possessions and seizing money, books, clothes and other personal items, the party was taken back to the town by boat, making a great spectacle for the crowds who came to see what was happening. Without any of their possessions, their hopes for reaching Holland were dashed. The group were arrested and brought to Boston Guildhall, where the Corporation of Boston administered the town's affairs and the magistrates sat to hear cases. They were brought before the magistrates, and messengers were sent to inform the Privy Council in London of what had happened, but they were held for a whole month before the magistrates were instructed to release the majority, sending them back to where they came from, and to hold the 7 ringleaders for longer and hand them over to the Higher Assizes Court in Lincoln. Bradford, who was only 18 at this point, recalled that they were treated courteously by the magistrates, who showed them what favour they could, and the group presumably were not under significant hardship during their month of being held. People in the town had strong sympathy towards non-conforming beliefs and treated the group accordingly during their time with them. They didn't see the separatists as bad people at all, and the empathy towards them at this point would follow through later with the arrival of Puritan minister John Cotton. It's not known if the 7 ringleaders of the escape attempt in Boston ever attended the Higher Court in Lincoln. They were sent on their way there by the authorities in Boston without escort, which tells us something about the regard within which they were held. Some of them apparently ended up further north in Lincolnshire, in Gainsborough, instead, ready to escape up the River Trent. Another of the leaders, Thomas Helwys, arranged a barge from Gainsborough for around 12 passengers, which increased to over 80 once they got to Immingham after sailing up the River Trent and into the Humber. Their final escape was dramatic. They were spotted by armed militia from the coast near Immingham, and the captain of the ship they were boarding decided to set sail, leaving behind the women and children who had become stuck in the flats in small boats at low tide. The men endured a turbulent voyage in bad weather before arriving in Amsterdam, and were only reunited with their families some months later. The women couldn't be kept in England without anyone to provide for them, and so had been released by the authorities. After a year in Amsterdam, the separatist search for their religious ideal led to internal schisms, and the group split. Clifton, who had held a high position in the church in Amsterdam, was involved in many high religious debates. He remained there, while others followed his protege, John Robinson, to the neighbouring city of Leiden. Clifton died in Amsterdam in 1616, but his religious influence lived on among those who were to become the Pilgrims, as did that of Robinson, who became an important advisor and correspondent to the Pilgrims once they arrived in America, a land that he himself would never see. Helwys led a passionate career in the church and is credited with becoming the founder of the Baptist denomination, along with John Smith. He returned to England in 1612 to challenge the king and church. He wrote a book calling for toleration of differing beliefs and sent it to the king. He was imprisoned in Newgate jail and was dead by 1616. After 12 years in Holland, the Leiden separatists decided that they needed to leave for a variety of reasons. Their children were becoming too Dutch, and despite moving there to find religious tolerance, they found some of the other churches too much for them to tolerate. The truce between the Dutch and the Catholic Spanish was reaching its end and presented a threat to their Protestant way of life. And they knew of ships that had started to sail for America to attempt to establish new colonies. In 1620, the Leiden separatists left Delfshaven in the Speedwell to meet up with the Mayflower in Southampton, a ship full of future colonists sponsored by the voyage's financial backers, the merchant adventurers. The two ships set off from Southampton, but the Speedwell wasn't seaworthy, possibly sabotaged by a crew reluctant to make a voyage into the unknown. They stopped off in Dartmouth for repairs before embarking once again for America. The leaks continued, however, and the ships returned to Plymouth, where the Speedwell was deemed not seaworthy. Those willing to make the voyage crowded onto the Mayflower and set off again. Her passengers were now a mixture of religious separatists and economic migrants. It was now mid-September and the Atlantic voyage was late in the year. It took 66 days to reach America, but not Virginia, where they intended, instead being forced to land further north in Massachusetts. So, they arrived in the wrong place at the wrong time of year, and without the requisite permission from the state. They drew up and signed a document which is now known as the Mayflower Compact to commit everyone to working together in order to survive as a civil body politic. It was winter. There were 102 passengers on the ship and few died on the journey, but in the first year, half of them died of disease or starvation. Here begins a new story which includes the essential role played by the Native American Wampanoag who helped the Pilgrims survive. And obviously, recognising that their story was continuing on from the thousands of years they and their ancestors had been living there. Something which is lost and diminished by the European view of this as a new world. This story becomes one about colonisation and the significance of the Mayflower story as a symbol for many other migrations that were taking place at that time, and the embedded inequalities that began to be established alongside the beginnings of slavery and the capitalist system. William Bradford was 30 when he made the voyage on the Mayflower. He became an influential man of status in the new colony and was governor a number of times. Later in life, he documented the endeavours, trials and tests of the group in his journal, which is how we know much of their story. This told the story of his life from England to Holland to America, and the journal itself had an interesting history. The manuscript had disappeared by 1780, but was later found in the Bishop of London's library in Fulham Palace in London. There was then a debate over the rightful home of the manuscript, and eventually it was returned to Massachusetts in 1897, which is the same year that the General Society of Mayflower Descendants was founded. Once in America, the Pilgrims established the colony of Plymouth on an abandoned Native American settlement called Patuxet. The indigenous population had declined dramatically following earlier contact with Europeans, and many of them succumbing to diseases that were new to them during a period called the Great Dying. Groups that had lived on the coast had retracted inland, and the Pilgrims made contact with them early on, sending one of their prominent leaders to negotiate, called Edward Winslow. Winslow was wealthier than many other passengers on the voyage. He's the only pilgrim who ever had a portrait of him during his lifetime. He was originally from Droitwich near Worcester and was a member of the Pilgrims Church in Leiden, along with many of the separatists who had been arrested in Boston in 1607. His role in Plymouth Colony included leading expeditions and forming trade relationships with local indigenous groups like the Wampanoag. He acted as the colony's governor 3 times and as an assistant to Bradford when he was governor. He was involved in politics and defence of the colony from opponents in England and undertook a number of trips between England and Massachusetts. On his trip of 1623 to London, Edward wrote a letter which has survived as a document in the archives. The letter is beautifully written with Winslow's iconic signature and is to Robert Jackson of Spalding and inquires after his father-in-law's health. The letter's interesting because it confirms the links within a wide network of separatist influence at the time of the 1607 arrests. The letter reads, "To his much respected uncle Robert Jackson, these be given. Sir, though unknown, I remember a kinsman's love unto you, desiring to be remembered to my father-in-law, to whom as to yourself my wife remembereth her duty. Almost 2 years since, I wrote to my father-in-law, declaring the death of his son White, and the continued health of his daughter and her 2 children. Also how that God's providence she was become my wife, whom, praised be God, I left in health at Plymouth in New England the 10th September last, past myself being now at London, upon some business between the plantation there and the company of adventurers and the council here, and am to return again about December next. Having therefore a fit opportunity, I thought it but my duty to write unto you, sorrowing that I have not time to acquaint you with our proceedings, but promise you a large relation thereof before my departure. In the general, we have undergone many straits and difficulties, and yet have many hopes of future comforts. My wife has 1 child by me, but it pleased him that gave it to take it unto himself. I left her with child at my departure, whom God preserve, but hope to be with her before her delivery. I never yet received any letter from any of her friends, only I hear that some are now gone over, which I missed. I shall be very glad to hear from you before my return. If you write direct your letters to Mr. James Shirley Haberdasher of Small Wares at his house in Crooked Lane and his shop at the Horseshoe on London Bridge. I pray you send word how my father-in-law does and where he lives, also concerning my wife's brother and sisters, to whom I pray you commend our best affections. Thus expecting your answer, I take leave this 30th of October, 1623. So who were Robert and Richard Jackson, and why did Edward Winslow write the letter? Robert Jackson was the brother of Edward's father-in-law, Richard Jackson, and another brother, John. Edward Winslow's first wife had died in the first winter the colony experienced after their arrival in 1620. He married a recently widowed member of that colony, Susanna White, whose maiden name was Jackson. She was the daughter of Richard and niece to Robert and John. I hope you're keeping up with all this. Though originally from near Doncaster, John and Robert had moved with their father, James Jackson, to near Spalding around 1580. Susanna's father, Richard, had stayed near Doncaster and eventually relocated to Scrooby, which is where the intrigue begins. Richard Jackson was an associate of William Brewster in Scrooby and one of those who eventually left for Holland. It even appears that Richard leased part of Scrooby Manor from William Brewster to live in, and a signature on the Scrooby Manor lease from 1604 is the same signature as on letters between himself and his brother Robert. Richard was obviously an active separatist, participating in the secret separatist church services at Scrooby Manor prior to 1607, and with a close relationship to his family near Spalding. John and Robert Jackson were well-connected men, and both were clerks to the courts of sewers in Spalding, which we know were made up of influential men of the county and the justices of the peace and magistrates for the area. Incredibly, they both held the position during 1607, the same year the influential separatists, including Brewster and Clifton, were arrested and tried by the very magistrates that John and Robert were clerks to and knew so well. Why then had Boston been chosen as the site to secretly worship and plot to escape to Holland? The evidence of the relationship between the Jacksons and Spalding and their brother Richard and the congregation at Scrooby hints at a much wider web of influence and secrecy, far beyond what was known for a long time. There had to be confidence among the separatists in 1607 that there was sympathy towards their cause in Boston. Despite their betrayal and arrest, that sympathy is evident in William Bradford's version of sympathetic treatment here by the magistrates, who showed them what favour they could. But this isn't surprising if the clerks and the local magistrates knew and sympathised with their quest, and the links between Boston and Scrooby were as well developed as it appears. Edward Winslow's letter directed to his uncle helped uncover a trace of that wider web and proves emphatically that Boston was not chosen by accident as a destination to depart from. Once established in America, contact between those who remained in England and their colonial counterparts continued regularly. The Plymouth colonists sought to recruit more people to join them, and more ships began to make the voyage. Their first winter there was difficult. They had to build homes and deal with starvation and disease, and within a year, half of them had died. They needed more people to sustain their plans for the colony, but at the same time, others were beginning to plan other settlements. The trickle of migration that took place in the 1620s turned into a flood in the decade that followed. Back in Boston, just a few years after the Pilgrims failed to escape from there, Reverend John Cotton was appointed vicar at St Botolph's Church in 1612. Cotton was born in Derby and studied at Cambridge University to become a vicar, as had many of the Pilgrim leaders who were subsequently thrown out or had left the church because of their views. He was a Puritan in his beliefs and wanted to reform the church from within rather than separate from it entirely. His charismatic personality brought large congregations to his long and impassioned sermons from far and wide. He was often in conflict with the church authorities for his conduct, but grew a strong and radical following in the town and surrounding area, including the wealthy and influential as well as ordinary people. Eventually, life within the established church became intolerable, and his congregation, under his influence, left Boston to found a new city, which they named in honour of the town they had lived, loved and left behind. Cotton emigrated himself in 1633 and went on to become the first teacher of the first church in Boston, Massachusetts, and one of the most widely admired men in the state. While in Boston, Cotton practiced nonconformity in his church by refusing to make the sign of the cross in baptism, for example, or not wearing clerical robes or kneeling for communion. He was suspended twice, but had strong support from the community in Boston, which led to his suspension being lifted. Cotton preached sermons on Sundays and early on Thursday and Friday mornings and on Saturday afternoons. Lots of church. He attracted people from the surrounding area, including Anne Hutchinson, who was from Alford. He spoke about the church's imperfections, but was a critic of separatism and spoke directly to those who were known as saints, or members of the congregation who had experienced God's grace. Let's go back now to what connects the separatist incidents with the later emerging Puritan sympathies, and that connection is the draper Leonard Beatson. He was one of those illicit conventiclers and was later connected to Reverend Cotton through influential leaders in Boston at the time and the Chamber of Council. Beatson went on to become a member of that council in 1620, the same year his separatist colleagues were themselves setting sail for America on the Mayflower. His relationship with Cotton and his influential followers who sat and met in this council chamber reveals a wider nonconformist influence in the dealings of the town. It shows that a strong Puritan influence was well established within the Boston's council long before many left for America to be instrumental in the foundation of a new city, state and society. It's incredible to think that Beatson, in his role of councillor, sat in this very room, no doubt passionately discussing the affairs of the town and the church with other ardent followers of John Cotton, including fellow councillors Thomas Leverett and Atherton Hoare. Both of these men were hugely influential in the founding of Boston, Massachusetts, and in its administration and governance. Beatson died in 1625, but the Puritan influence of John Cotton and his followers continued until the 1630 migration from Boston began for America. Over the next 3 years, 1 in every 10 Bostonians left for a new life in America, including many educated individuals of wealth, power and influence. Leverett and Hoare were among those influential individuals. Hoare was a merchant who became a councillor in 1619 and mayor in 1628, and an alderman of the council until he too left with Leverett and Cotton in 1633. Upon arrival in the new Boston, he was well respected and became a magistrate and a member of the colony's council. Leverett was elected to the council in the same session as Beatson in 1620. He became coroner to the council and was elected an alderman in 1632, whilst the migration from Boston was at its peak. He took the decision to leave and sailed with his family and John Cotton to the new Boston in 1633. He was a ruling elder of the First Church and, importantly, along with Cotton, a founder of the first American school, the Latin Free School, based entirely on Boston Grammar School that he had left behind. His son John, who was born here in 1616, went on to become governor in Boston in 1674 until his death in 1679. It was during this period that a devastating war broke out, known as King Philip's War, in 1675-6, a massive conflict with Native Americans that affected the whole of New England. Leverett acted to support Plymouth colony and marshalled support from colonial towns against the indigenous groups. His strategy has been described as aggressive as he took the war to Native American places, raised troops from the Native American praying towns, and supported the policy of selling captives into slavery in the West Indies. The devastation of that war effectively ended Native American resistance in southern New England. Towards the end of the 1620s, the demands on Cotton to conform were growing, and he started considering his choices. He was friends with some of those who were promoting the Massachusetts Bay Colony, north of Plymouth. And in April 1630, he went to Southampton to deliver the farewell sermon to the 400 emigrating settlers of the Winthrop fleet, which included emigrants from Boston. His sermon, God's promise to his plantation, justified the colonisation, called on the colonists to live godly lives, and encouraged the conversion of the natives. Cotton himself was not ready to make the journey until 1633. Cotton's congregation decided to leave with Cotton's friend from Cambridge, John Winthrop, a member of the Massachusetts Bay Company, under their recently granted charter giving them permission to establish a colony. There were 11 ships in the fleet, which carried nearly 700 passengers. Winthrop's flagship, Arbella, named after Lady Arbella Clinton, the daughter of the 5th Earl of Lincoln, Thomas Clinton, who sailed to America but died shortly afterwards. The Talbot, which carried Winthrop's son Henry, the Ambrose, the Jewel, another Mayflower, a different one, the Whale, the Success, the Charles, the William and Francis, the Hopewell, and the Trial. Winthrop's own sermon expressed his goals for the new plantation, and that by undertaking the venture, they were entering into a covenant with God. He felt they were under an obligation to form an exemplary society that would serve as an inspiration for men everywhere. I don't know what the women thought. Winthrop saw the new colony as a reaction to the competitive ways of England, where moral self-restraint would prevent merchants making excessive profits, and this could be moderated by government if needed. As Puritans, they wanted to develop a renewed sense of community, to build a city upon a hill. A Puritan orthodoxy developed in New England, which was self-governing. The elect men, or so-called saints, controlled these congregations, their finances, and chose the ministers. This was in sharp contrast to England, where wealthy landlords often held these powers. Attendance at church was compulsory, and the relationship between church and state was close, as meeting houses and churches were often the same place. To become a church member or a saint, you had to offer a soul-bearing revelation describing the moment of conversion to the rest of the congregation, something which was uncomfortable for many and ultimately caused declining formal membership. The colony was economically successful. They brought their original charter from King Charles with them to America, preventing it from being taken back or interfered with. They became a self-governing religious commonwealth, escaping the trials and restrictions of life in England. By the mid-18th century, the colony had a large trade industry exporting fish, lumber, and farm products to Europe. Slavery played an important role in the economy too. From 1644, Boston merchants were involved in the triangle trade, whereby slaves were imported from Africa, sold to the West Indies, from where sugar cane and molasses were then brought back to Boston to make molasses and rum. Winthrop helped write the law making slavery legal in 1641 in Massachusetts, and it was the first of the colonies to do this. Boston wasn't without its own religious controversies and dissenting opinions. The close relationship between church and state was something that one of those dissenters, Roger Williams, objected to. Williams feared the state's role in potentially corrupting the church and its saints, and so he was banished to establish the colony of Rhode Island further south, and this was the only colony to practice religious toleration. Another dissenting voice was that of Anne Hutchinson, one of John Cotton's original Boston congregation. Originally from Alford, she arrived in Massachusetts in 1634. She showed a lack of respect for ministers whose doctrine she didn't agree with and was influenced by Cotton in the strength of her belief. She was valued as a midwife and supported those seeking conversion into saints through spiritual counselling. However, theological rifts emerged as she attacked the clergy's authority to interpret scripture. Her followers were labelled antinomians, meaning those opposed to the rule of law. Hutchinson was also a woman, challenging men's roles in the church and state. She was brought to trial for sedition and could have been acquitted based on her superior knowledge of scripture, until she claimed she could communicate directly with the Holy Spirit, something which they believed hadn't happened since New Testament times. She was banished and settled in Rhode Island until moving to New Netherland, where she was killed in a war with Indians in 1643. Winthrop had spoken of his vision for the colony before leaving England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. The 1630s was a period of mass migration to the new colonies and was followed in England by civil war. Some of the immigrants would return, and there was regular travel and correspondence between Britain and America. Boston was flourishing as a city, but its own economic success ultimately put it at odds with the British government over tax and fair representation in Parliament. 4 generations later, and there was rising discontent among some of those whose families had made the voyage to America. We've got to it. Are you still with me? As American opposition to British authority in Boston grew, matters came to a head on the night of the 16th of December in 1773. In May that year, Parliament in London passed the Tea Act, which got rid of all import duties on tea entering England, which meant that it lowered the price of tea to people buying it and that its official supplier could trade directly with consumers rather than through wholesalers. The Act was intended to prop up this official supplier, the East India Company, as they teetered close to bankruptcy. The East India Company had the monopoly on porting tea into the British Empire, but faced competition from smugglers and people not drinking their tea, leaving tons of it rotting in warehouses. And they couldn't be allowed to fail. Does that sound familiar? The Prime Minister, Lord North, recognised the value of the company as part of the imperial infrastructure in India, where it was instrumental in maintaining British authority there at its own expense. The upshot was that the price of tea from the East India Company fell far below the price of smuggled tea. Here, there was an expectation that Americans would want to buy the cheaper official tea, which had been taxed and the taxes flown back to London, rather than buying the now more expensive smuggled tea. American colonial assemblies were alarmed, however, and decided to resist the importation of tea. 3 ships were soon to arrive in Boston. On the 28th of November, the Dartmouth arrived at Griffin's Wharf in Boston, followed by the Eleanor, and on the 2nd of December, and on the 15th of December, a ship called the Beaver also arrived. The last of 3 ships sailing from London, the Beaver was delayed there after there was a case of smallpox on board, and so was quarantined for 2 weeks in the outer harbour. A 4th ship, the William, ran aground in a storm off Cape Cod on the 10th of December. These 3 ships each carried over 100 chests of British East India Company tea, which had come from China. Benjamin Woods Labourer's The Boston Tea Party says the 3 ships contained 240 chests of Buhi, 15 of Conju, 10 of Souchong, all black teas, 60 of Singlo, and 15 of Hyson, which are both green teas. Green tea accounted for about 22% of the volume and 30% of the value. Spring-picked Hyson was a favourite tea. Singlo, green, larger leaf tea, was picked later in the season and wasn't well known in the colonies, but it was included this time because the East India Company had too much in stock that needed drinking before it spoiled, and they were hoping the Americans would get a taste for it. The common black tea made up the bulk of the shipment. This Buhi, a corruption of the name for the Wuyi Mountains south of Shanghai, forgive my pronunciation on any of this if anybody knows better, was so popular that the word Buhi became the slang term for tea. One London publication described Buhi as infusing a dark and dull brownish red colour, which on standing deposits a black sediment. The liquor is sometimes faint, frequently smoky, but always unpleasant. The superior form of Buhi is known as Conju. 70% of the tea imported was Conju, which brewed a deep, transparent red liquor with a strong and pleasant bitter flavour. Souchong is a classic black tea from the Wuyi Mountains of Fujian province with a distinctive smoky aroma as a result of the drying process. Souchong means small leaf variety and dates back to 1717. The tea needed to be taxed on arrival when it was due to be unloaded, and no later than 20 days after the arrival of the tea. Otherwise, the ships and their cargoes of tea could be seized by the authorities. The 17th of December was the deadline to pay the tax on the tea in the Dartmouth. After the ship arrived, the clandestine political organisation known as the Sons of Liberty began distributing pamphlets declaring, "Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea shipped for this port by the East India Company is now arrived in the harbour. The hour of destruction or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny stares you in the face." Meetings were then held regularly to discuss what should be done. They were led by Samuel Adams, who called a meeting on the evening of the 16th of December in Boston's Old South Church, where he addressed a crowd of 5,000, warning them of the approaching deadline and declaring that this meeting can do no more to save the country. A mob of around 200 men, roughly dressed as Mohawk Indians and with soot-darkened faces, subsequently headed for the wharf. They crept onto the 3 ships. The crowd followed, and thousands watched as they smashed open 342 chests of tea and heaved 45 tons of it overboard. After an hour's work, they dispersed quietly. No one had been assaulted, and John Adams, whose name is remembered here as John Adams Way and a main route through Boston, wrote, "Last night, 3 cargoes of Boohee tea were emptied into the sea. This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire." The teas thrown overboard were actually past their best, having been picked in 1770 and 1771, transported by ship to London warehouses until they were put on ships bound for the colonies in late summer 1773. At this time, Thomas Hutchinson was the town's governor, appointed by the Crown in 1771. Hutchinson, remember that name, was the great-great-grandson of Anne Hutchinson, who you may remember was ejected from the colony so many years earlier. He played many significant roles before becoming governor, including member and later Speaker in the Massachusetts Assembly, Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice. His family was wealthy and he was well educated, having attended Harvard College. In his role as Royal Governor, Hutchinson maintained that if British authority was reasserted, peace could be restored to Massachusetts, which was becoming an increasingly turbulent colonial environment. Hutchinson believed he could enforce the Tea Act, being reassured by the presence of British warships in Boston Harbour. Both he and his sons owned a large amount of stock in the East India Company and did a lot of business with them. After the Boston Tea Party, Hutchinson was summoned to London. The king wanted to know about the state of the province. While he hoped to one day return to his beloved Massachusetts, he never did, dying in London in 1780. He'd been well received in Britain, meeting with George III and receiving a doctorate from Oxford. He continued to work towards reconciliation between the two sides, but as a loyalist to the Crown, he became marginalised and a target for revolutionaries like John and Samuel Adams, who made their reputations as his opponents. The legacy of the earlier Boston migrations in and after 1630, including people from Lincolnshire, in this case Anne Hutchinson from Alford, continued to echo through to the events which sparked the Revolution and the colony's eventual independence from Britain. Anne's own son Edward was born in Alford and emigrated to Massachusetts following his mother to Rhode Island before returning to Boston, where the family subsequently established themselves, with his son Colonel Elisha Hutchinson and his son Captain Thomas Hutchinson, the wealthy merchant father of Governor Thomas Hutchinson. The British were enraged by the Boston Tea Party and put in place punitive measures. As a consequence, the British Parliament issued the Coercive Acts, or as they were known in America, the Intolerable Acts. The first act, the Boston Port Bill, closed Boston Harbour until the colonies paid for the lost tea. The second act, the Massachusetts Government Act, revoked their charter and made the colonies' government less democratic. The Administration of Justice Act and the Quartering Act made colonists feel as though they were under military rule. Trial by jury was restricted and more British troops were drafted in to show military force. Town meetings were forbidden, except for choosing local officers, and replaced the elected Council of Massachusetts with an appointed one. General Thomas Gage was appointed as a military governor and arrived with 4 regiments, which was a devastating blow to the colonists. New Englanders became convinced that the Crown intended to corrode traditional English liberties in North America. So although these acts were only aimed at Massachusetts, they instead pushed the colonies to the brink of revolution. Until this point, the different colonies in America had been fairly separate, but there was a growing sense of unity between the colonists over the idea that Parliament could impose taxes without their consent. They started to communicate with each other through committees of correspondence and called for a trade embargo on British goods, followed by a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. 56 delegates met, including some of the most prominent politicians from across the colonies: Samuel and John Adams from Massachusetts, John Jay from New York, Joseph Galloway and John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, and Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee and George Washington from Virginia. They sought to try to defend American rights without the need for war. They concluded with some strong resolutions, rejected the coercive acts, and petitioned King George III, pleading their case by arguing that the impositions on the colonies by Parliament were unconstitutional. They hoped George would end the crisis by dismissing the ministers responsible for the acts. George III instinctively recognised rebellion. Colonial patriots undermined American loyalists to Britain, forcing merchants to burn British imports and rejecting clergy who preached pro-British sermons. Alternative congresses were springing up in opposition to royal government. Citizen militias, so-called Minutemen, organised themselves to be able to respond to an emergency. In April 1775, Governor Gage was ordered by the British government to suppress the resistance and arrest the leaders. He sent 700 British soldiers to seize colonial military supplies from Concord, northwest of Boston. Two couriers, William Dorr and Paul Revere, alerted Patriot leaders nearby in Lexington. Revere went on to witness the opening skirmish of the American War of Independence. By the end of the day, the British Redcoats had lost 273 men. Within a day, 20,000 New Englanders besieged the garrison in Boston. Although the Continental Congress sought to mediate with the king by sending him the Olive Branch Petition, news of the battles reaching Britain and the growing death toll hardened attitudes against the rebellion. Even John Adams hoped for reconciliation at this point, although delegates to the Congress would soon approve establishment of an American Continental Army to be led by George Washington. It was a more recent immigrant to the colonies that played a role next. Thomas Paine, originally from Norfolk and sometime of Lincolnshire, arrived in America in 1774 and in 1776 published Common Sense. His straightforward writing called out what couldn't be said by Americans up to that point, which was that the conspiracy against American liberty was not the fault of corrupt politicians, but rather the institution of monarchy and its empire. The crown wasn't going to save them. He argued that America could stand apart from Britain economically and ideologically. His pamphlet sold 100,000 copies in 3 months, and the final barriers to independence evaporated. On the 2nd of July 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Virginia Resolution and created the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia drafted a statement to justify the separation, which was then approved on the 4th of July. This Declaration of Independence outlined the colonies' grievances against the British government and asserted their right to replace it with their own government. Its focus on equality of all individuals and a natural entitlement to justice, liberty and self-fulfilment deliberately overlooked the role of slavery. Equality of all didn't stretch to black people, poor white men or women. Boston City upon a hill would continue to play a prominent role in the psyche of the new nation, inspiring John F. Kennedy among others. Kennedy, whose father dedicated the American Room in next door's Fidel House during his ambassadorship to the UK, made a famous speech recalling Winthrop in tribute to his home state of Massachusetts while president-elect in 1961. He said, "The enduring qualities of Massachusetts, the common threads woven by the Pilgrim and the Puritan, the fisherman and the farmer, the Yankee and the immigrant, will not be and could not be forgotten in this nation's executive mansion. I have been guided by the standard John Winthrop set before his shipmates on the flagship Arbella 331 years ago, as they too faced the task of building a new government on a perilous frontier. We must always consider, he said, that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. Today, the eyes of all people are truly upon us, and our governments in every branch at every level, national, state and local, must be as a city upon a hill, constructed and inhabited by men aware of their great trust and their great responsibilities. For we are setting out upon a voyage in 1961, no less hazardous than that undertaken by the Arbella in 1630. We are committing ourselves to tasks of statecraft no less awesome than that of governing the Massachusetts Bay Colony, beset as it was then by terror without and disorder within. American values and mythology of national origins have had and continue to play a significant role in how Americans see themselves and how the rest of the world sees America. Boston's connections to the Pilgrims and Puritans puts it at the heart of the American version of national identity, both official and mythologized. Of the early colonies, not all the stories of their establishment endured, except where they were well documented for whatever reason. The early attempt at a colony in Jamestown gave rise to the story of Pocahontas, a strong and recognized origin story for the American South. The Plymouth Pilgrims created a colony which lasted longer and eventually became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony based in Boston. Bradford recognised the value of telling their story, which was then picked up much later for its significant democratic and legal legacy. In 1802, John Quincy Adams, who went on to become the 6th American president and was the son of John Adams, declared the Mayflower Compact, recorded by Bradford, was the forerunner of ideas expressed in the US Constitution. Such praise, a long time after the event, contributed to making this story of a single ship out of many making the transatlantic voyage so important. It became a founding story for the new US nation. The Pilgrims' first Thanksgiving in America, a year after their arrival, became an important American celebration of national identity over time, but was only declared a national event during the American Civil War. Represented here in a letter sent by Sarah Josepha Hale, making the case for it to President Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War pitched North against South, and identities, values and heritage were part of this turmoil. With the North's eventual success, so the Pilgrim story from the North became the official origin story for the renewed nation, winning out over the South's Jamestown origins narrative. The mythology surrounding the story began. What kind of legacies then do these stories have? They speak of things which resonate with people today, about tolerance, democracy, freedom, rights, responsibilities, morality and faith. But they also hide the flip side of many of these values, and as we look more closely, we begin to see intolerance, slavery, servitude, suppression, oppression, suffering, and hidden voices. In telling these stories today, we have the chance to explore the things that matter to our communities today and understand how this place is connected to so many other places around the world. The Mayflower 400 anniversary commemorations in 2020 built on a long-established and memorialised heritage, interwoven with a complicated set of national and regional narratives. Commemoration of this story and the Boston 400 story has been expressed through different forms of the so-called US-UK special relationship, in civic form, in religious form, connected to shared military history and partnerships, and through genealogy. The wider Christian heritage narrative connected to our region is important for its links to leaders, thinkers, writers and advocates whose lives and works have led to the formation of a range of non-conformist traditions, including the Congregationalists, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Quakers and the Salvation Army. You can see memorials and plaques to these stories across our region, and sometimes these have helped create the heritage which visitors want to see, including the Scotia Creek obelisk, General Society of Mayflower Descendants tall plaques from 1955, and the Guildhall stone plaques above the Pilgrims cells downstairs. Transported have been involved in some more recent commissions marking the area's connection to these famous stories, including the Horizon sculpture at Scotia Creek and Rachel Carter's bronze Pilgrim women sculpture on a plinth behind St Botolph's Church, with partner sculptures which can also be seen in Gainsborough and Doncaster. You might like to read more about the stories in our online magazine, Radical Roots, and I think we've got some leaflets somewhere at the back which gives you the link to those magazines online. We're getting to the end now. Just put a few things up here in case anybody's interested in finding out more about the story. There's some really interesting books out there on the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, the invention of the United States, and Ron Chernow's book on Alexander Hamilton, or you could just watch Hamilton the musical, which was my starting point. There's some really interesting websites as well which are pertinent to today, to 2020, and also looking forwards to 2026 when it's the 250th anniversary of the establishment of the United States of America, and 2030, the 400th anniversary of Boston, Massachusetts. I just mentioned as well, talking to Sandra about the partnership of the historic Bostons, which is about the history of Boston, Lincolnshire and Boston, Massachusetts. They have a really interesting set of resources online and a lecture and events programme, and you're planning a talk in the new year that talks about that. There's no date yet, but there will be more information. They have got a website and they've also got a Facebook group that you can join. I've done a couple of books talking about the Pilgrim story, one for children or children at heart, and a history guide to the sites in the Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire and South Yorkshire region, which will be available here, but unfortunately are sat in my hallway at home as I dashed out this morning. But there will be some here soon. So we've got to the end now. I'd just like to say thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening. Please do share your feedback with us. Transported is funded by Arts Council England, and getting your feedback about the events on offer is really valuable to us and to our funders. You might see at the back some transported tea bags. On the back of those is a QR code, which if you scan will take you to an online version of the survey. We also have got some paper forms as well for you to fill in. And we've got some tea at the back, and I'm led to believe it's the tea that I was talking about. So it's very special tea. It's not your standard transported tea, it's authentic Boston Tea Party tea, and Luke at the back is an expert on that, so please do feel free to ask him about that tea and have a taste. And have we got coffee in case that people... Okay, it's tea all the way then. So, yeah, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and I'm around, so if anybody would like a chat or has any questions, please do grab me. Thank you very much.